People always assume they know who you are just by looking at you. That's the mistake my grandson's new boss made, and it cost him everything. I'm 73 years old. I drive a 12-year-old Ford F-150 with a dent on the passenger door I keep meaning to fix. I wear flannel shirts most days, and I get my hair cut at the same barbershop in Spokane I've been going to since 1987. From the outside, I look exactly like what I am now, a retired man who spends his mornings drinking coffee on the porch and his afternoons tending a vegetable garden that produces more zucchini than any one person could ever reasonably eat. What I don't talk about, what I almost never mention, is the 31 years I spent before all that. I was a field linguist with the Defense Intelligence Agency. I won't get into the specifics because some of it still isn't mine to share. What I can say is that I spent the better part of 3 decades moving between postings in Germany, Japan, Colombia, and a handful of places that don't show up in the tourist brochures. I learned languages the hard way, not in classrooms, but in markets and interrogation rooms and embassy lobbies where getting it wrong had consequences I don't like to think about anymore. By the time I retired, I spoke German fluently, Japanese well enough to negotiate, Spanish like I was born in Guadalajara, and Russian I dreamed in, sometimes, on the bad nights. When I left the agency, I wanted quiet. I wanted to not matter to anyone for a while. My wife Rosalind was already gone by then. Cancer took her in 2009, 2 years before I filed my retirement papers. And my son lived up in Spokane with his wife and my grandson, a kid named Blake, who had his grandmother's eyes and her stubbornness, and, thankfully, none of my worst habits. I moved into a small house 20 minutes from them, close enough to be useful, far enough not to be underfoot. Blake was 26 when all of this happened. He'd been working at a commercial real estate development firm called Harrington & Cross for just over a year. He was smart, genuinely smart, the kind of kid who reads industry reports for fun and builds spreadsheets the way other people do crossword puzzles. He'd been pitching a proposal to redevelop a decommissioned industrial site on the east side of the city into mixed-use housing, and from what he told me, his numbers were solid. His research was thorough. He'd spent 4 months on it. His boss was a man named Sébastien Fournier. Fournier was French-Canadian, originally from Montreal, though he'd lived in the States long enough to have mostly smoothed it over. He was in his mid-40s, the kind of man who wears a watch that costs more than most people's cars and makes sure you notice it. He had that particular quality some men have, the ability to make you feel, in a very polite way, like you're slightly beneath him. He'd been brought in from a firm in Toronto the previous spring to head up Harrington & Cross's expansion strategy. And from what Blake described, he ran his team with a very specific kind of favoritism. The people who agreed with him went up. The people who challenged him didn't last. Blake had been careful, cautious. He hadn't pushed back openly, but he also hadn't stopped working on his proposal, and Fournier knew it. It was a Thursday evening in late October when my son called and asked if I'd like to join them for dinner. The firm was taking a few people out to celebrate a contract they'd closed, and Blake had asked if his grandfather could come. I said yes without thinking twice. I like a good meal. I hadn't seen Blake in 3 weeks. The restaurant was called Eau Claire. It was downtown, the kind of place with no prices on the menu, and lighting dim enough that you have to hold your phone over the breadbasket to read the card. French cuisine, white tablecloths, a sommelier who appeared at intervals like a very quiet ghost. There were 8 of us at the table. Blake sat to my left. Across from us was a colleague of his, a young woman named Petra, who worked in the acquisitions department and had the expression of someone waiting for a bus that was already 10 minutes late. Next to her was a man from the legal team whose name I didn't catch. At the head of the table sat Fournier, and beside him a woman he introduced as his associate, Isabelle, who'd flown in from Montreal for the week. From the moment I sat down, I could feel it. The way Fournier looked at me, just briefly, just once, when Blake introduced me. That slight recalibration behind his eyes. The polite smile that didn't quite reach. He shook my hand, said it was lovely to meet me, and then turned to talk to someone else. I've been read as insignificant by professionals. It didn't bother me. I ordered the onion soup and sat back and listened. The conversation around the table was pleasant enough at first. Contracts, market conditions, the new stadium project going up north of downtown. Fournier was charming in the way that powerful men often are when they're performing, animated, attentive, laughing at the right moments. Then he said something to Isabelle in French. It was quiet enough that the others at the table likely didn't catch it. He leaned slightly toward her and said in French that Blake's proposal was a good imitation of real strategic thinking, that it showed effort, if not instinct, that someone should have told the boy that working hard and working smart were two different things. Isabelle smiled, said also in French that at least his grandfather seemed like a sweet old man. Fournier glanced at me and said, "I'm translating precisely. He looks like he wandered in from a hardware store. Probably has no idea what half these menu items are." I picked up my bread roll. I looked at the menu. I thought about Rosalind. I said nothing. Over the next 45 minutes, the French conversation continued. Not constantly, they switched between French and English depending on the audience. But whenever Fournier wanted to say something he didn't want the table to fully hear, he defaulted to French. He made a comment about Petra being overqualified and underpaid and too loyal to notice. He said something dismissive about the legal team. And at one point, when Blake mentioned a detail from his proposal, Fournier said to Isabelle that it was almost a shame. The boy had done genuinely good work, and it was too bad he'd never get the credit for it. That one stopped me. I set my fork down quietly. I didn't look up immediately. I took a breath, the way I learned to take a breath 30 years ago in a room in Bogota, when the information I'd just received was worse than I'd been prepared for. And I had exactly 4 seconds to decide what to do with my face. Then I looked at Isabelle and asked her in French whether she preferred the duck or the fish. The silence that followed was very small and very complete. She stared at me. I watched the information reorganize itself behind her eyes. Fournier's head turned slowly. He looked at me the way a man looks at something he was certain wasn't a threat and is now being forced to reconsider. I smiled at him pleasantly. He said in French, "You speak French?" I said in French, "I've spoken it for about 40 years. I picked it up in Paris originally, but I spent some time in Lyon and Bordeaux as well. The regional differences in pronunciation are interesting. Yours is Quebec away. I'd guess Montreal, not Quebec City. The vowels are different." His face had gone, as they say, white. Blake was looking between us. He understood enough to know something significant had just happened, but not enough to know exactly what. I turned to Blake and said, in English, "Your boss mentioned a few minutes ago that he thought your proposal showed real effort. He also mentioned to his colleague just now that it was a shame you might not get proper credit for it." I paused. "I thought you should know." The table had gone quiet in a way that restaurants sometimes do, that particular stillness when the ambient noise continues, but the people at one table have all simultaneously stopped breathing. Fournier said something then that I won't repeat. He was flustered and it wasn't his best moment. I didn't raise my voice. I never had to. I said calmly, still in English, "I spent 31 years working in situations where precision mattered. Words meant things. I promise you, I haven't misremembered anything said at this table tonight." I looked at him evenly, and I'd suggest, going forward, that you be careful about assuming a man's value based on the shirt he's wearing. There was a man at the far end of the table. I hadn't paid much attention to him during dinner, but I learned later that he was Andrew Harrington, the senior partner. He'd been brought along to celebrate the contract, and he'd been sitting quietly at the end of the table the way senior partners sometimes do at these dinners. watchful, eating his steak. He had heard everything. Petra, it turned out, had some French too, enough to have followed the broader shape of the conversation. She had, as I later learned, been quietly furious about certain things for several months. That evening gave her something to do with that fury. Blake told me later that things moved quickly after that dinner. I won't pretend I know all the details. Some of it is his story to tell, but the short version is that Fournier's behavior that evening, combined with some other concerns that came to light in the days that followed, led to a review by the senior partners. Blake was asked to present his proposal directly to Andrew Harrington and 2 members of the board. He did. His numbers were his numbers. His research was his research, and with no one standing between him and the room, it was obvious that the work was his. The East Side redevelopment proposal was approved 6 weeks later. Fournier left the firm before Thanksgiving. I found out on a Sunday afternoon when Blake drove over and sat with me on the porch, and we drank coffee and watched the neighbor's dog investigate my garden with the intensity of a detective who suspects the zucchini. He was quiet for a while. Then he said he wished he'd known more about what I did before he was born. He said he'd always thought of me as just his grandfather. I told him that was exactly what I wanted. He laughed a little. Then he said, "Why didn't you say anything sooner?" When Fournier started in on the French, I thought about how to answer that honestly. I told him there's a version of that situation where you reveal your hand immediately and you get the satisfaction of watching someone's expression change, and that satisfaction lasts about 30 seconds. And then there's the version where you wait, where you collect what you need to collect, where you let a man tell you exactly who he is before you decide what to do about it. Blake nodded slowly. I told him I'd also been praying about it. I know that's not what some people want to hear, but it's the truth. Sitting at that table, listening to things I wasn't supposed to understand, I felt that stillness I've come to associate with being exactly where I'm supposed to be. I felt it before, in a lot of different rooms, in a lot of different countries, at moments that mattered more than I ever wanted them to. I've learned, after 73 years, to trust it. You never know when what you've been given is going to matter. The things I learned, the languages, the patience, the discipline of not reacting, I didn't know sitting in a classroom in Washington, D.C. in 1978, that they'd eventually matter most in a French restaurant in Spokane while protecting my grandson's career. But that's how it works, in my experience. The things you carry for a reason, even when you can't see it yet. Blake stayed for dinner that evening. My son and his wife came over later, and we ordered pizza and sat around the kitchen table like we used to when Blake was 12 years old and small enough to fall asleep on the couch before 9 o'clock. Before he left that night, Blake hugged me for a long time in the driveway. He said, "Thank you, Grandpa." I said, "That's what I'm here for." I watched his taillights disappear at the end of the road. The October air was cold and clean, and somewhere down the block somebody was burning leaves. That particular smell that always makes me think of everything that's gone and everything that's still here. I went inside. I made tea. I sat in the chair by the window where Rosalind used to sit when she couldn't sleep, and I thought about 45 years of living a life that probably looked, from the outside, like it was mostly about being quiet and unremarkable. I thought, sometimes the whole point of a long life is one moment where everything you've been quietly carrying turns out to be exactly what someone you love needed. Then I drank my tea and went to bed. Respect everyone you meet. Not because they can expose you, not because they might have something you want, but because they're a person. You never know what someone has lived through. You never know what they're carrying. And you never know, not ever, who's listening. I've been sitting with this story for a while now, turning it over the way you turn a stone in your hand, not looking for anything in particular, just feeling the weight of it. What strikes me most isn't the dinner. It isn't the moment Sebastian's expression changed, or the silence that followed when I answered him in his own language. Those things were satisfying, I won't pretend otherwise. But they're not what stays with me. What stays with me is Blake's face in the driveway that night, the way he hugged me like he was 12 years old again, the way he said thank you and meant something bigger than the word. I think about the choices that led to that moment, not just mine, but his. Blake spent 4 months on a proposal that wasn't guaranteed to go anywhere. He built the research, ran the numbers, revised the models at night after long days, and he kept going even when the man above him was quietly ensuring he'd never get the recognition for it. That's not a small thing. That kind of persistence, the willingness to do honest work in an environment that isn't rewarding you for it, that comes from somewhere deep. You either have it or you don't. And if you have it, it's because somewhere along the way you decided that the quality of your effort matters regardless of who's watching. Sebastian made a different kind of choice. He was talented enough to run a team, skilled enough to earn a seat at a serious table, and he used those gifts to take credit for someone else's work and make private jokes at an old man's expense. That's not a villain's mistake. It's a character mistake, the kind that compounds quietly over years until one dinner in a French restaurant where you've forgotten to account for the possibility that the man in the flannel shirt might have spent 3 decades in rooms where the cost of carelessness was higher than you can imagine. What undid Sebastian wasn't bad luck. It was the natural consequence of who he had chosen to be. I learned something about character a long time ago, in circumstances I don't discuss at dinner tables. I learned that it isn't what you do when people are watching. It's the version of yourself you default to when you're certain no one important is listening. Sebastian defaulted to contempt. Blake defaulted to work. Those two things, over time, are not equal. The patience I showed that evening, waiting, listening, collecting what I needed before I acted, that didn't come naturally to me. I had to learn it. I spent years learning to stay still when every instinct said move, learning to think before speaking in rooms where the wrong word had consequences. That discipline, the kind you build slowly and carry quietly, is what allowed me to be useful to Blake in the specific moment he needed it. You don't know, when you're requiring something hard, what it's being prepared for. You just have to trust that nothing you learned with integrity is wasted. And Blake will carry his own version of that now. He stood in front of Andrew Harrington and the board with his own work, and he was enough. That's the thing I most wanted for him. Not rescue, but the experience of being sufficient on his own terms. The knowledge that the ground under him is solid because he built it himself. I'm 73 years old. I drive a truck with a dent I keep meaning to fix. Most days, the biggest decision I make is whether the garden needs water. But I was exactly where I was supposed to be that October evening. I believe, without apology, that the life you build through honest effort and genuine care for other people tends, eventually, to place you in the right room at the right moment. The rest, as they say, is just showing up.